welcome everybody. Welcome. I greatly appreciate you all coming in here today, and also to for being patient while we work out some of the technical glitches. So I want to welcome everybody to our panel on the history of correctional reform. This is actually the second in a series of panels that we had and will continue to have, examining correctional reform from a historical lens. It's hosted by BU's Metropolitan College and our partners at the Correctional Reform Working Group. And I want to start by thanking our panelists and our moderator, Deborah Becker, that have graciously given their time and their expertise, their deep and diverse experience in and around the justice system, and as movers in correctional reform efforts. They represent people with lived experiences in the justice system, with frontline work experience, with work around budgeting, legal issues, and leadership of initiatives. Our audience will gain a lot from this discussion, I promise you. The thing that I really encourage you to focus on as you pay attention, especially students, younger professionals who might be working in and around the field, is to pay attention to the forces that shaped reform efforts during this time period. There's historical forces at work, organizational forces, internal and external to the organizations that members of our panel were part of. In many ways, they navigated these forces, they overcame them in a lot of times, took advantage of them to enact lasting and meaningful effort of reforms that did, in fact, as you will see today, have an impact on the quality of justice that was occurring within the state during the time period. So I do hope that you will get a lot out of this experience, out of this discussion, and that we can also connect after and with a reception. And finally, I want to just thank some of the members of the group that helped to sort of develop this panel, organize the materials for it, which are also online, and you will see access to that in your program, that there's a website that has additional materials that sort of augment this. We have Professor Jim Matazants and Bob Cadigan, Sammy Mariano, who's now solving yet another major issue for us and has been invaluable in making things work, and Olivia Savard, who will be closing out the ceremony tonight, or the panel tonight, trying to connect with students and building a body of students who will work with them as advocates for reform with the working group. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Jim Matazants, who will formally introduce the panel, and then to Deborah Becker, our moderator. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you for coming. I see some of my students here, I see colleagues, I see people I've worked with. The co-founder of this group, Professor Cadigan. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first, very briefly. I'm a former superintendent. I served as a superintendent in the State Department of Corrections for the last 15 years of my career. I also spent some time running a jail, Norfolk County Jail. Before corrections, I worked in DMH for a few years during deinstitutionalization. Overall, I had about 30 years in corrections, formally. Then I began teaching about it. The folks at Boston University asked me if I wanted to teach. Professor Cronin, several of his colleagues brought me in, and I love it, I have to say that. So we're trying to blend the practice of criminal justice, the practice of corrections with theory. And this group was formed to achieve some of those goals. The group started about 2.5 years ago. We called ourselves the Correctional Reform Working Group. It's made up of leaders, but also students. It's made up of folks that have worked in the system, folks that are gonna be working in the future, academics, researchers, faculty. And we strive to understand change. What does it take to reform systems? What does it take to reform corrections? And look at the success and even some of the failures of the past. Today we're going to look at one of the most innovative and impactful leaders of correctional reform in Massachusetts, Commissioner Frank Hall, who sadly passed away a few weeks ago. But you're going to hear from the people that he promoted and the people that he brought into the system. And these are the people that worked for him. These are the people that he promoted and led. And those are the people that carried on his mission and put the systems in place and dealt with the budgets, dealt with the legislature, dealt with the resistance, and got the job done. So you're going to hear from them. So today's symposium is going to they're going to tell their story of what happened and how they did it. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Deb Becker, who graciously has volunteered to help us. So, thank you.
Welcome everyone. So glad to see all of you. And I'm a reporter and host at WBUR, and one of my primary beats is covering corrections. So I know a little bit about what's happening now, but I certainly didn't know what was happening in the 70s at this time, during this time period that we're going to look at today. It's a very short period of time when Frank Hall was the commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Correction, but it's amazing to me how much work was done during that time and how many really innovative ideas about how to make incarceration better, but not just incarceration. How to improve public safety overall by making sure that the state was doing incarceration correctly. So I really, there's a lot to cover, and I really think you'll find it very, very compelling. So I think I'm going to introduce our panelists first, so you can know who all of them are, and they'll each do a little bit of a presentation. I'll ask them some questions, and then we will take your questions through Slido, which you should see in your program. You can Google on your phone, Slido, type in the code for this event, and submit the questions. And at the end of their presentation, I will make sure to get as many questions as possible. I can't say we'll get all of them. Hopefully we will. As many questions as possible to the panelists. We will be having a reception afterward as well. So if there are some questions that we don't get to, you may be able to ask some of the panelists afterward. So the folks with us today, we have Chris Richmond with us. He's a former Deputy Commissioner for Community Corrections. Also, Dave Haley. He's the former Chief of Staff to DOC Commissioner Frank Hall and a Deputy Superintendent. Jim Serko's with us. He's a former Assistant Secretary for Criminal Justice in the Executive Office of Human Services. Ellen O'Connor is with us, former Deputy Commissioner for Administration and Finance. And Lee Bromberg is with us, Chief Counsel for the Department of Correction during the 1970s. And Ramadan Shabazz, who was incarcerated while Frank Hall was commissioner, and he was recently released, but he did participate in some of the programs that we're going to be talking about today, because one of the key issues that these folks actually recommended and implemented dealt with pre-release and community corrections. And there was a real thinking, believe it or not, 50 years ago. Sometimes looking at the Department of Correction today, you might not believe it, but 50 years ago, there was a real belief that if people were incarcerated and they were taught skills and they were treated humanely, they would be better when they got released. And so we're going to be hearing from them about that. And you know, when they asked me to help moderate this, I think I was reminded of the saying, you can't row forward without looking back, right? And I think if we're going to go forward in corrections, I'm assuming all of you are interested in that, I think we need to look back. And this was a very important period of time to look at and to see what lessons might be taken today. So we have our discussion divided into three parts. The first part is the environment. So we need to know the context of what was happening then, what was going on preceding the 70s when Frank Hall took over, and what challenges did he have to address. The second phase of our presentation today will be what we did, what they did, And the third will be pre-releasing community corrections, which I alluded to earlier. I'm really excited about this discussion because it's not as if we're just telling you what happened 50 years ago. You're actually getting to hear from the people who made it happen, who devised the programs and who implemented them. So I look forward to hearing from all of them, and I'm going to start with Chris Richmond. Chris.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Deb, and thank you all for coming. Before I start, I just want to say that most of us here, and there are a couple of others that worked with us in the audience who we'll introduce as we go, really started our careers in the Department of Corrections in Massachusetts. And, you know, after 50 years, I think most of us would also tell you that that experience in the prison reform movement here in the 70s was one of the most rewarding times in our careers. And I think we would all tell you that. So it really, you know, looking back at it has been kind of a fascinating journey for us. Let me just start quickly with a real thumbnail of prison reform, sort of the genesis of prison reform in the U.S. In the mid-'60s, the federal government, the Johnson administration started, actually getting legislation passed that entailed a prison reform architecture. And in 1967, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Act created two things. One, it authorized the use of furloughs, pre-release, community-based programs, education release, alcohol and drug programs. But it also created a federal agency, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, that was to enable grant giving to states for law enforcement agencies. Primarily, the users of those grants were police forces and corrections departments. But interestingly, the states did not immediately pick up on that, even with the federal incentive, financial incentive, did not really pick up on their own pieces of legislation or their own reform movements for a number of years. And what the real sort of galvanization to that was the unfortunate series of riots in the very early 70s, Attica being probably the most notorious and most covered, but also San Quentin and New Mexico and Arizona. There were nationally covered prison riots. And as a result, it really pushed states to start passing their own legislation and getting federal money to do that. My career actually started in North Carolina with Frank Hall, and we were the beneficiaries of a number of innovative programs down there that were funded all by LEA. In 1971, Massachusetts appointed John Boone. I think those of you who are here for the last session heard a lot about that. And he was hired as a reform commissioner, very much dedicated to that. But he was given a big impetus by the passage in 1972 of what we call Chapter 777, which was the authorization in Massachusetts for the granting furloughs, pre-release and work release, and education release, and drug and alcohol programs. The pre-release eligibilities were created if you were 18 months before your parole date, you could be moved to a pre-release setting. And additionally, for the first time in Massachusetts, reception diagnostic centers were authorized, and so that gave the sort of the big legislative blanket to pushing a prison reform agenda. Let me move now to both Dave and Jim are going to talk a little bit about, on my left, are going to talk a little bit about what that was like. Both of them were working in the Department of Corrections for John Boone and working both at Norfolk and at Walpole when the problems really started at the end of John Boone's tenure. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that experience. Let me just say that Dave Haley was a deputy superintendent, but he also was the deputy commissioner for classification and treatment and a deputy commissioner for institutional services at the time that we were there. So let me just turn it over, I guess, Dave, do you start, or Jim starts? Sorry, Jim. No.
It's all right. Thanks, Chris. Just a little bit more about John Boone. John Boone came up through the federal system. He started off as a federal correction officer and became the warden for Lorton Federal Penitentiary. He had come up through the system, and he was hired in Massachusetts. He was the first black commissioner of any major state in the country. His priority, of course, was to implement Chapter 777, and he focused on community-based corrections. And at the time, the Department of Youth Services was closing reform schools. And John stepped up and took those reform schools for corrections and turned them into pre-release centers. They were ready-made for that type of use. We know a lot more about John Boone now than we did back then. He wrote a lot after he left Massachusetts. He wrote that prisons were terrible places that stripped a man of his dignity as well as his freedom. He called prisons the last vestige of slavery. When he left Massachusetts, he said that he had come to Massachusetts as a reformer and left as an abolitionist. If you lived in Massachusetts during John Boone's administration, you couldn't help but talk about prisons, conditions, and how he was looking to change the system. He really introduced Massachusetts and the people of Massachusetts to understand what happened in our prisons. And he deserves a lot of credit for that. Dave?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, okay.
Yep.
First of all, we'd like to thank all of you for coming. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging a couple of people just quickly. In the audience is Shelley Isaacson, who started and been very instrumental in helping us put all this together. But Shelley started her career at MCI Framingham as a relief correction officer, then was a social worker, was the director of volunteer services, and then moved up to the central office where she became Frank Hall's third executive assistant. Chris and I were the first two, and she was recruited to take over that role after us. She's then, and do it right. We've all been friends for 50 years, been throwing zingers at each other forever. Shelley was the one absolutely who got it right. And then later on, she had a significant role in classification for the entire department. And we went to areas. She became the director of operations in Area 3, which is a very large area that included Walpole and Norfolk and Southeastern Correctional Center, plus some pre-release centers. So she is shyer than the rest of us. We wanted her on the panel. She said she would prefer to take questions from you if you wish, but she's waving her hand right now, and she's had a really interesting career. I would also point out, for all the hostage situations and riots, when we were in the command post, Shelley was always in the command post, so she saw firsthand how Frank and the rest of us had to deal with all of those particular issues. Just quickly, the other person who's going to get an introduction separately is Dr. Frank Carney, because there are four of us here, Frank Carney, Jim Serco, myself, and Shelley. We all started, and the three of us started in the Boone administration. Frank started when Moses was a very young man. But we have that experience of having overlap from the Boone administration. You were probably there before Jack Fitzpatrick, right? Yeah. So, yeah. So, and Jim tells me he was as well. So
how old were you?
Well, Frank is 101. One of the things that I've been asked to do is I would describe it as setting the table, to tell you a little bit about the Boone administration toward the end of it, some important things that happened during what was there, but some things that were noteworthy because they turned out to be the things that Frank Hall had to try to address. So historically, corrections was set up for punishment, deterrence, retribution, and sometime after Attica, we began introducing the whole concept of rehabilitation, and John Boone was very much about rehabilitation. And to his credit, we wanted to start positively. To his credit, when Chapter 77 was passed, he was the one that helped push through that legislation. It was signed in the yard at MCI Norfolk with him president and Governor Sargent president in 1972, and a number of inmates who had contributed president as well. But he was the one that began to roll out the programs that Chris has mentioned, a very significant effort. The system itself, as a result of his administration, I would generally characterize as significantly in chaos in more than one facility. Walpole at one point was identified as the single most or one of the most violent prisons in America. We had revolving superintendents. At one point, we had 7 superintendents who came through there. One superintendent who was recruited by Commissioner Boone came from California, a career warden, and he lasted exactly 6 months at Walpole before he quit and went back to California. We had wildcat job actions, strikes by the correction officers. An inmate who was pretty famous here, he blew himself up in the foundry at MCL Walpole making homemade weapons and bombs. Inmates were being murdered. Drugs were being used by inmates. There were numerous overdoses. We had 5, initially 3 part-time and only 2 full-time doctors within the facility. So some doctors were actually on call. I remember the doc at Framingham, I believe, was on call, and you had to reach out and find them if an inmate needed some type of help or assistance. The NPA was trying to organize inmates into a union. There were riots, including the St. Patrick's Day riot at Walpole, where inmates were drunk, abusive, and they tore up Walpole. There was a significant amount of damage that was done in the St. Patrick's Day riot. Inmates were in fear of their lives. They were carrying weapons, including shivs, mostly shivs, homemade knives. Inmates at one point were swallowing razor blades, wrapped in tinfoil, so they could get a trip out to the Shattuck Hospital or Pondville Hospital, because the blades would show up on an X-ray, but they didn't tear up their insides. They were also cutting themselves. So our doc at Norfolk was running up to Walpole. Dick Della Penna from Norfolk was running up to Walpole all the time to help Bernie Pastorell, the doc at MCI Walpole. Inmates were assaulting other inmates. Inmates took hostages. There were fires in cell blocks. The correction officers were extremely bitter and had strong concerns about John Boone's policies, and particularly what they viewed as his progressive agenda. There were racist comments being made about Commissioner Boone. The correction officers were concerned about the loss of union jobs with the introduction of community-based programs. There was significant opposition to the furlough program, including the fact that we were initially furloughing inmates from MCI Walpole, including some lifers from MCI Walpole. So for those of you who don't know, at that time we had 1 maximum security prison, and that was Walpole. At the same time, different agency in DYS, Jerome Miller was tipping over the DYS system, closing the training schools, cloning some of the facilities. For a while, there were no secure detention facilities. Some kids were being arrested, brought to court, brought to facility, walking out the back door on the same day. So the press was all over DYS, all over the Department of Correction. And at one point, John Boone, I believe, was the second most recognizable individual in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts behind John Boone, behind Governor Frank Sargent. It was quite a situation. One other place I'd mention, MCI Norfolk, which shares the same piece of property as Walpole, as medium security, a very different type of facility. It was designed, and the first superintendent was a man named Howard Gill. It was designed to be a community within a community. Inmates lived in living units, 50 persons per unit. They didn't live in cells and cell blocks. Inside, it looked like a small, I always described it as a small rundown college campus. There were prison industries. There was an administration building, an auditorium. B.B. King performed there. Jimmy Hoffa came when he got out of prison to address the inmates there. There were gardens and ball fields. There was an inmate council where 2 inmates were elected to be co-camp chairman of the inmate council. It was very different. And one of the things that I always thought was a positive thing was George Bollinger, the first superintendent selected by John Boone, provided stability. He was there for the entire John Boone administration. Interesting about him, he was Howard Gill's protege, but he also, when he first went to Norfolk, he lived in the prison yard in an inmate building for the first 6 weeks he was there. He hadn't moved his family yet, so he lived inside the prison for 6 weeks. I mentioned 777 was signed in the yard. We were calm, and things were calm until July of 1972, and on that day, an inmate who I'm not going to name passed 2 guns from his wife in the visiting room at Norfolk. He then subsequently, it was an aborted escape attempt. Jim Souza, who was a correction officer, I worked with every day as a member of a team in one of the 7 units, was working in overtime that day, so he was in uniform. He knew the inmate and began walking toward him to try to give him the guns. He was shot and killed. The other correction officer in the unit, Dave Mackey, he was shot and wounded and didn't come back to work for years. And then because when it was a boarded attempt, when they got out of the visiting room, they couldn't make it out of the prison, so they ran back into the prison yard. Ray Baranowski, who was an industrial shop manager, was walking toward the administration building, and at some point, while the inmate had decided that he was going to kill any staff member that he saw, and he shot and killed Alfred Baranowski. He then barricaded himself in his unit at 7-3. Toward the end of the day, he shot and killed himself, shot his wife, who died later on at the hospital. So that particular day, I've always described as the worst day that I've ever had at work, because I had just been out of the Army. I was in a room directly above when the shooting happened. I knew it was gunfire, went downstairs and saw what had happened. It was a pretty awful, just horrible thing to see and to experience. One other good thing I'll just point out, Shelley worked at Framingham, and she reminded us this. At one point, John Boone transferred lifers from Walpole and Norfolk to MCI Framingham to serve as trustees. First time men had ever been in the women's prison at Framingham. And Framingham, Shelley told me, went back to the 1870s? 1877. He also transferred some correction officers because they wanted male correction officers to be there in charge of the trustees. Quite an unusual decision. We were trying to figure out in the car today coming in why that may have happened, and neither one of us really knew, but we believe it occurred in March of 1973 when John Boone was still there. So that's a little bit of what the system was like before Frank Hall arrived. When I said chaotic, there was a lot of unrest. It really was chaotic.
I think there might be some trauma bonding among you guys here. It sounds like there was a lot of unrest. And we should say, now, of course, we have Sousa Baranowski, the maximum security prison in Massachusetts. But so, Jim Serco, well, how'd you get out of that?
I'll answer your question first. I was 21.
Okay, thank you.
We were all pretty young.
21.
John Boone introduced civilian observers into Walpole. He thought that would calm the situation. Walpole was the focus. But there was a lot of other things. There were a lot of other things going on in the department at the time that we miss. And that is the establishment of pre-release centers. But when the civilian observers were asked to come into Walpole, the correction officers saw that as the last straw, and they walked off the job. John Boone called in folks like Dave, myself. You weren't there the first day. I was there the first day when John Boone came to the auditorium after the officers had walked off, and he gave a rousing speech to the inmates. He asked that all of them be brought to the cafeteria or the auditorium, I don't remember which. And he basically said, the officers are gone. We're going to open the institution tomorrow, and we're going to run it the way we always have. We're going to go back to work. We're going to our avocations. You're going to educational programs. And the inmates were very excited about that. And on 12-hour shifts from there for the next 8 days, non-uniform staff like myself and Dave and folks from Central Office and Frank Carney and many others manned the blocks, the visiting rooms. Initially, it was relatively calm. I'd go around opening cells on A2, saying, good morning, breakfast is on. I have to say, I met an inmate many years later at Shirley who said, do you remember me? And I said, no. And he said, good morning, breakfast is on. No one had ever told me in 10 years that I spent at Walpole. Small acts of kindness don't go unrecognized. After 8 days of that, we saw that the inmates were obtaining drugs. They were lighting fires. I was in the visiting room, I think substituting for you, Frank, when an inmate was being out of place with his visitor, and I warned him. And when he didn't stop, I ended his visit. It wasn't long after that that one of the inmates in A2 told me, if I were you, kid, I wouldn't come in tomorrow. We took that seriously. There was also an inmate during that period of time who was found on the toilet, jacked up with a syringe, and he was dead. we recognized that we were not in control of Walpole, and it was time for the civilians in the department to leave. The observers stayed, but we asked the superintendent in no uncertain terms if we could leave. And so the substitutes for the correction officers, if you will, also walked off the job. Not something I'm proud of, not something that I look back at as something that was anything other than a negative experience. But that was the way we left. It went on for about a month and a half, and there have been books written about this when the inmates ran Walpole, and paints a different picture, saying that it was relatively calm, that there was calm within the institution. But we know afterwards, at the end of the day, and I talked with the Secretary of Human Services as part of this project, Peter Goldmark, who told me that John Boone had lost control of Walpole, and that was the end of it, and he was fired. That went on for 2 months, and that was the end of John Boone's administration, unfortunately.
And so in comes Frank Hall into
That
that
was what
lovely
Frank Hall was
situation.
walking into,
So
yes.
this is what Frank Hall is walking into. So Dave, what do you think? I mean, what were some of the okay, we get it that it was really chaotic, but what were some of the main issues and, you know, maybe legislative constituencies and others that he had to deal with to try to make maybe a different impression, maybe last a little longer than John Boone?
Yeah, we all felt that we were concerned about what was going to happen with a new commissioner coming in. We didn't really quite know what was going to happen. Peter Goldmark, the Secretary of Human Services, commissioned one of his staff to conduct a national search, and he, among other places, he looked in North Carolina, and he had a conversation with Lee Bounds, who was a very well-known progressive commissioner in North Carolina, who had just been involved in introducing a reform program in North Carolina that include community-based programs, and he recommended Frank. Frank Hall was undergraduate from Chapel Hill, and he had his master's from the Maxwell School at Syracuse. He started his career as an assistant to the commissioner, and then became an area director and the director of program services in the North Carolina system. One of the things that was significant was that he actually had an area that included various custody levels for inmates, and he had, all told, in his area, he had about 30 institutions under his span of control. So one of the things that was somewhat unusual, he was appointed by Frank Sargent, who was a Republican governor, but then after the 1974 election was reappointed by Michael Dukakis, a Democratic governor. So he actually served from September of '73 until January of 1979. That didn't often happen. A lot of times when a governor comes in, they want their own people who run their own long march. So it's really surprising that he was held over, but I think it worked to the benefit of the Commonwealth. He certainly discovered that there was chaos at Walpole. He knew he needed to address the revolving superintendent issue at Walpole, and he found a very solid individual to come in and do that. The press was terrible in the department. We were being beaten up in the press every single day. The governor's office made it clear, as did the Executive Office of Human Services, they needed stability. They wanted the Department of Correction out of the news. The correction officers I mentioned were unhappy for a number of things, but one of them had to do with the fact that some of the community-based programs were going to be having individuals who were not going to be union members, and that whenever you take away a job from a union official or a union organization, it always creates a major amount of controversy. As I mentioned, we were furloughing inmates out of Walpole. We actually had to stop the furlough program at one point in order to get it under control. The murder of the two individuals at Norfolk, the two staff members, had created unrest at Norfolk as well. However, reformers still wanted the progressive programs to continue. There were members of the legislature that wanted them to continue, and community people wanted them to continue. But and there were even some press people who wanted them to continue, but they wanted some sense of order and structure, and that was very much a part of what Frank Hall was called upon to do. One of the other significant things he did was hire a brand new superintendent for MCI Norfolk, who remained there until 2 years before Frank left, and when Larry Meacham, moved up to the central office. So for about 5 years, we had a lot of stability at MCI Norfolk. Frank reached out to the members of the press. One of the things I was impressed by, and later on when I became a commissioner, I tried to follow his lead. Frank understood that reporters had editors, they had bosses. And when they called, they needed to get some information. And so he made a point of making certain that he either returned a call or he had the public information officer return the call. And he knew that if he couldn't answer a question, he would try to give a response that the reporter could use that would satisfy his editor. The same thing happened with the members of the legislature. We had two legislative guys who were back and forth, bringing information, asking questions, getting information, bringing it back to the various members of the legislature, and that relationship was tremendous. He had a lot of support from Speaker Tommy McGee, from Senate President Kevin Harrington. He ended up, despite the fact some reporters wrote some negative stories, he was never a hater. He would continue to talk to those reporters and answer their questions. And one thing that I would note, at one point, because of all the controversy about the furlough program, there was a real attempt in the legislature to curtail the furlough program. Kevin Harrington, who was the Senate President, was 6'10". He was from the North Shore. And he literally put the bill in his pocket. There were 10 days left to go in the legislative session. So there's a term that's used, pocket veto, but he literally pocket vetoed that bill, and he said, if somebody is big enough to take it out of my pocket, we'll see what happens. And the legislative session ended, and the program was not curtailed, largely because of Frank Hall's relationship with members of the legislature and the leadership. And then the other thing I would mention is we had something called the Governor's Advisory Committee on Corrections, all volunteers. The chair was Bob Palmer, who was an executive at Polaroid, who had known both Governor Sargent and Governor Dukakis. There were some very high-level people, including Ed Rodman, Reverend Ed Rodman, who just died 2 weeks ago, Hugh Jones, who was a major attorney at Hale and Dorr, and we had a lifer, Martin Feeney, was a member of that, the Governor's Advisory Committee on Corrections. And Frank worked with them and dealt with them. He made sure they had access to the prisons. He listened to what they had to say. If he could, he would take their suggestions. If he couldn't, he would tell them why. But he viewed them as partners with a clear understanding that he was still the decision-making. He retained responsibility, he could delegate authority, but he was always interested in hearing what other people had to say. And Shelley has pointed out in a number of our conversations, he did the same thing with all of us, his staff. We were all young, we were all in our 20s, and yet he would let us go at him if we thought we had a better way to do it, and he would listen, and oftentimes he would take a suggestion. He was, I've always characterized him as a charismatic leader. He was a Pied Piper, but he knew how to bring a team together and how to utilize a team, and those were the beginnings of what he had to try to accomplish.
I'm particularly interested, obviously, in dealing with the media and reporters. It's incredibly difficult to deal with the current Department of Correction. There's not a lot of transparency, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that public persona and the coverage of correction really sort of affected Frank Hall, and what do you think it did for his efforts to reform, Chris?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting you lead with that, because the other thing I would say, that the transparency that he, was his, way of operating, was also the way he could communicate what it is he wanted to do. So it was not just listening; it was also, trying to push every channel. It was the same story he would say inside as the same story he would say outside. So it was never two different stories about what was going on and what he wanted to do. So, I would just going to start a little bit on his vision here, and characterize his vision for running the department. It really is sort of three legs of a stool, but fundamentally it was balance. I mean, if you spend any time with him, that word would always come up in talking about his philosophy about how to manage these, this system. And the balance was that it was not a trade-off. It was a simultaneous solve where you had to improve security, you had to improve safety, well-being for inmates. You had to make sure that that contraband was off the yard, that guns were not there, all the things we found. That had to be a paramount priority, that you had to get security right. At the same time, you had to employ a humane treatment for inmates, and that had two parts to it. One was we had to improve and increase programs inside the institutions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the other was he had a firm belief, and as we all did, is that the way to keep the public safe was to reduce recidivism. Then you actually had to pay attention to what that was about. And his full belief was that if you implemented Chapter 777 and created community programs and created pre-release programs and created those opportunities to normalize as best you could an inmate's transition from prison to the community, that would have a positive effect on recidivism. And we'll mention actually what those numbers were like. The third piece of that stool is, was bringing a data-based, basically, a numbers-based review of what it is we were doing. So research was a hugely important part of how we actually behaved. We actually behaved in trying to manage these programs as Frank Carney would give us reports every day, every week. I know we had so many reports, Frank, it was tiring. But but it was a way that you had to, he was data driven. I mean, this was not just because he was a do-gooder or we just wanted to get reformed right. It was, well, what reform actually was going to matter? And fortunately for us, I think some of the things we did matter, and you'll see in a few minutes, how that occurred. But Jim, so that was kind of the balance issue was the main thing that kind of ran through his administration, and I think Jim, you were going to reflect a little bit on a more personal view of his vision.
As superintendent, right, of MCI Shirley.
Superintendent.
Yeah.
In the midst of all of that, at 26 years old, I became superintendent of MCI Shirley, which Frank said would be the job of a lifetime. He actually wasn't wrong about that, and I can look back and say that as commissioner, Frank would talk to you about his goals, about what he looked forward to in the system, and he thought that sending me to Shirley, which was the largest pre-release center at the time, and he promised me that day that he hired me he was going to double it. And he lived up to that promise. So by the time I left 3 years later, there were 95 inmates. He was a strong supporter of pre-release centers. He thought we overclassified in the system, that too many people were at Walpole. In 1976, he called for the closing of Walpole along with his governor's advisory committee on corrections. Frank was a personable guy. When you think back of the managers and those who are just starting your career, my first commissioner was Jack Fitzpatrick, and I met him in the hallway, and he asked me to come to a fellowship meeting that he was holding with inmates, members of the community, and it was in that spirit that Frank also engaged everyone he met. He knew most everyone by, maybe not everyone, but he was personable, and he wanted to know about you, whether you were an inmate, a correction officer, someone who was getting an opportunity of a lifetime, such as myself, and focused on what a community-based correctional facility can do for those who are leaving prison and how important it was. I have to say there's one story. He visited Shirley quite a bit, but there was one visit that stands out to me, and that's the visit that he didn't make. He had been intending to come out with Lavelle Diet, who was a talk show host, a very famous talk show host. And he said he'd be out there in the morning. We didn't hear from him till the afternoon, and he called and apologized. He said that on his CB radio, he had heard that there was an armed robber, I think it was in Concord. And in front of him, while he's driving out on Route 2, I believe, he saw what appeared to be the perpetrator of that robbery. Frank ran him off the road. He was a bit of a cowboy. But that tells you a little bit about Frank. There's one other element to what Frank believed very firmly, and that is that what we were doing in pre-release centers was focusing on public safety. that it was best for public safety that people not leave maximums, medium, and even minimum security institutions without a transitional experience. And he was right about that, and he didn't have the data that we have today for you.
Yeah, we're gonna look at that data. It seems, almost common sense now. I wonder, Chris, how would you describe it? Sort of not just, sort of what his priorities were, but what were the stakes at the time and some of the key priorities of Frank Hall?
Yeah, yeah. So given that environment that you've heard about that he walked into, I mean, I think looking back on, what was at stake was really the entire promise of Chapter 777. So we had only, less than a year of implementation, and yet, for lots of different reasons, there's the blowback against, many of the reform efforts, particularly the furlough programs. Furlough program was pretty serious, and at the time, here's an out-of-state. The press, we were carpetbaggers. There were 7 of us that came from North Carolina, and why couldn't we hire somebody in Massachusetts to do this work, and that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of pushback. So what was at stake, I think, in our view, was really the promise of prison reform with that statute, and our ability to actually implement it was clearly at risk. The second thing I'd say, Deb, on this is that the other thing that was at stake was getting control of these institutions. You had to get responsible management to run a maximum security institution as a maximum security institution, and the things that entails, which is getting contraband off the yard, trying to protect inmate, create inmate safety, trying to protect people from getting hurt, and that we had to get the support of correctional officers, and we had to get negotiate with the unions to get that done. And so it was really the 2 things at stake, I think, were those things. It was Chapter 777, and we had some real, hairy times about getting things implemented there. And then the secondly was get into control of the institutions. Very quickly on the priorities, so the priorities were basically that. So his priorities were, first, get control of the system. Secondly, we needed to build the organization infrastructure to actually implement prison reforms. So what I mean by that is, to begin with, there were only 4 sentencing institutions in Massachusetts. So it was Walpole, Framingham, Concord, and Bridgewater. And so inmates were basically assigned to sentenced to those institutions. And this was before reception diagnostic centers, so we didn't have sort of pre-screening. They just came. And as a result of that, they were little fiefdoms. They were ships, floating on their own bottoms. So to the extent even that superintendents would go behind the commissioner, they had line item budgets, and they'd go to the legislature and try to get their own budgets negotiated, that sort of stuff. So the trick, of course, in managing people's, rational move from higher to lower security and getting the programs that they should be involved in right meant you had to have a case file that actually tracked all that, and you had to have a classification system that actually moved people appropriately, and and you had to have a legal system that did it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the second sort of priority was building that infrastructure. It doesn't sound sexy. It's not, nobody in the press cared about it, and it's actually how you had to run the place to actually make it work. And finally, we had, the third big priority was gaining support for expanding community corrections. So really, it was those 3 things. It was improve security in the big institutions. Implement a series of process improvements that could make the system work toward a pre-release engagement, and I think that's what we set out to do. And it really was pretty simple. It was kind of those 3 things.
Mm-hmm. So those are your objectives, and now let's move on to sort of the second phase of our discussion, which is really, what was done to implement some of these reforms, where the priority really was improving public safety, improving corrections, but also making sure that when people did leave incarceration, and more than 95% of the people who are incarcerated do leave, that they're prepared to leave and live productively on the outside. So I wonder, Chris, let's start with you, because you really had to implement a lot of these strategies. Just tell us how you sort of started some of these reform efforts and how you were going to get these moving forward.
Yeah, so I think there's these slides are interesting.
Your slides, yeah.
There's a slide on key strategies. So there were, there are lots of. I see. So I can do finger puppets. Yeah. So we had basically 4 key strategies. We as we were discussing this, kind of boiled it down to what were the key initial strategies around what we did. I mean, the first was, I've mentioned it already, was the organizational restructuring, and that really the first and foremost thing we did was really built a robust classification system. We had reception diagnostic centers. We had classification committees within the institutions. We had, as the organization grew, we had area classification systems. And those processes became much more sophisticated. So we could track, progress that an inmate made against program goals. We could then use that progress to move them to lower security. We tracked when their eligibilities, were for pre-release and built out those approvals. The second thing is, which I didn't mention on the last slide, was which we didn't see, was behind all this, as we were starting to implement this, was this drumbeat, particularly against the furlough program. This drumbeat from the public, and the public being the press, and lots of. Article, but lots of articles. Every escape that happened, whether they were that another crime was committed or not, and often most times it was not. But every escape was tracked, and there were, headlines. Prison reform has got to slow down. I mean, furloughs have got to slow down, and that kind of thing. And there was one article on the slide before that you didn't see, which said, but if you could see it, you could read, which said that. That Frank actually had to stop the furlough program for 3 weeks. And that really was to give the governor some air cover, because there'd been a pretty notorious escape. The governor asked us, quote unquote, to study the furlough program, which only took us 3 weeks, and to figure out how to, explain how we were going to administer it. And that was a classic Frank Hall, which is you take a step back to get 3 steps forward. And in my view, that one act saved the furlough program in the 1970s. And I'm going to give you some data at the end of this, which will blow your socks off as to how successful that program became. I would also tell you that furloughs have as much to do with the success of pre-release and community programs as almost anything else we did. And if there were anything I would say is, reinstating a furlough program here would be a great idea. However, so organization design we had to play with and start to get right. The second thing, of course, was staffing and leadership, and Frank did create some new positions. I mean, we had three deputy commissioners who we were appointed, and then we didn't have one for administration and budget. Alan, I guess until you came along, it was not important, but for some reason, nobody seemed to think budgeting was important. And that's because these institutions had their own budgets, right? So until you started trying to centralize control of that budgeting system and create what we call program budgets, they just didn't reflect any kind of a system point of view. We had to borrow a position from the Correctional Officer Training Academy to create a Deputy Commissioner for Administration and Finance, and that's how it first got funded. We also appointed quickly a chief furlough officer as part of this sort of relook at the furlough program and again get some control over basically who was going out, although it was still largely initiated by institutions. And we had a chief security officer who, was with a small security team that was kind of a little bit of a internal affairs group that started to really pay attention to security across the institutions. The third part I'm going to talk about quickly is just expanding programs inside the institutions, and we had a big push on community corrections, but the institutions also got built, those programs really got built up. So we had computer training programs, we had education programs, drug and alcohol programs. But probably most important and most impactful at the time was for the first time, we issued statewide contracts for both physical health and mental health services in those institutions. It's hugely impactful. It's the kind of thing you sort of forget when you think about prison reform. It doesn't sound like much of a reform, but it was a big deal. And we ended up doing the mental health side with McLean Hospital, who one of the most renowned mental hospitals in the country, and that I think started to turn the corner in terms of institutional health care. But finally, I wanted to mention sort of the process side, which again nobody pays attention to when you're studying this stuff. Is we had to build infrastructure around classification and furloughs and disciplinary processes and that thing, but we also didn't have really a legal infrastructure that supported running this this department as a system. And fortunately, we have the architect of really the legal infrastructure that existed then and probably for a long time after it. Lee Bromberg, who's sitting down here, clearly overdressed for this. Yeah, Lee's just come from winning a lawsuit or something. But Lee was just a great ad at the time, and he was the general counsel for the Department of Correction, but also was appointed an assistant attorney general of the state of Massachusetts. So he held both of those titles. I'm going to let him talk a little bit about some of the cases that really mattered a huge amount to us being able to get control of the system.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, while my colleagues up here were actually putting hands on and wrestling with this impossible task, I was out there having fun fighting battles in court. And the way that came about was that you've heard about the sort of the chaos in the system from the Boone years, and actually from before that, because these institutions were fiefdoms and they ran by their own rules, run by the superintendents. And part of my task was to try to get control of the system on the legal side. And Frank hired me, and he made a deal with Frank Bellotti, newly elected Attorney General, that we would be able to handle cases on behalf of the department and its officials when we got sued in prisoners' rights cases. And so I got this appointment as Special Assistant Attorney General. And I remember the interview with Frank Bellotti, and Frank Hall was there, and Frank Bellotti looked very relieved to take this messy group of cases and hand them off to somebody else. But that's how that happened. So then I quickly realized, after being in that job for not very long, that we didn't have the resources. So I had to hire some very high quality people to help me represent the department in all of these prisoners' rights cases. And I should back up and say what had happened in the 60s, there was tremendous social unrest. You've probably seen it in the history books. We all lived it because we're so old. But in the 70s, that kind of spilled over into the prison system. And there were many of my colleagues at the bar who thought they could crusade in prisoners' rights cases, and so they would bring any case you can think of, you name it. The mail policy is bad, the visiting policy is bad, the conditions are terrible. You can't move me from one prison to another prison without a due process hearing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any theory they could come up with. So there was an explosion of prisoners' rights cases, not only in Massachusetts, where we had a very active bar, but also around the country. And so the result of that was rulings being handed down by federal judges, one of whom said in his opinion, being a federal judge telling a commissioner how to run his prison system is a little bit like a grandparent dealing with his grandchild. You have lots of fun doing it, but you have no responsibility for the outcome. So, so that's the situation we were in, and some notable cases that I would refer to are the most notable, I think, was called Meacham versus Fano. Larry Meacham was one of these carpetbaggers from North Carolina who Frank Hall installed as the superintendent of Norfolk. And Norfolk had a series of unexplained fires, serious fires. So there was an investigation done, and 6 inmates who were determined to be the ringleaders of this process were moved from Norfolk back to Walpole, to a higher security situation. Well, they sued, and the district court judge and then the First Circuit, which hears all appeals in Massachusetts from the federal courts, ruled that, yes, they were entitled to a due process hearing. I think they were kind of thinking of the kind of due process hearing that you get if you're criminally charged, which all of these people had already had. That's how they got sentenced to prison. But that ruling was then taken up to the Supreme Court, and we argued it, and the court issued a ruling in 1976 that said you are not entitled to a due process hearing on a transfer from one level of custody in a prison to a higher level of custody. That's up to the prison authorities to decide that. And as Justice White, Whizzer White as he was known, an appointee of JFK, by the way, as he said in the opinion, the application of the due process clause here would place the clause astride the day-to-day functioning of state prisons and involve the judiciary in issues and discretionary decisions that are not the business of federal judges. So with that decision in place, and of course it was the U.S. Supreme Court, so that was nationwide law now, and still is as far as I know. And nonetheless, prisoners' rights advocates continued to bring these cases saying they need a due process hearing to do this. And maybe they will succeed someday. Maybe the appropriate facts will arise where that will be the case. But a notable case that arose right around the same time, I'll call the boss con case. We had a boss con, let's call him Smith, who was a big physical specimen, a very scary guy, and also a very, very powerful personality. He created safety concerns for other inmates and even a threat of escape when he was in a medium security setting. He was removed from medium security on orders of the commissioner. He was moved back to Walpole, and he sued, and he had a famous criminal defense lawyer who brought this suit named Dan Featherstone. So the court was Judge Julian, who looked like central casting for a central judge. Very handsome guy, white hair, so on and so forth. And he scheduled a TRO hearing, temporary restraining order, which is usually maybe an hour or two or maybe an afternoon, but this one went for 10 days. And I say, as the relatively new chief counsel, I'm wondering what's going on here. You know, all of these parade of witnesses are coming in, and he's subpoenaing people from the prison to say, "Oh, Smith is a great guy. We're not afraid of him," et cetera. So I put various people on stand, including Frank Hall, and Frank said, "No, we cannot control Smith in the medium security setting." So Judge Julian issued a ruling that found the facts exactly the way we said they were, but nonetheless ordered him moved to a medium, to a house of correction. So we filed a motion for a stay of his ruling, and under the rules you have to bring that first in front of the judge who had issued the ruling. So that was back to Judge Julian. So we went back in with Judge Julian. I said, "Frank, you got to go up there again," and basically the Frank Hall testimony was, "Now, Commissioner Hall, when you said that you couldn't control Smith in a lower custody setting, what did you mean?" And he repeated all of his testimony that he had already given. And so we're going through that, and Judge Julian says, "Hey, wait a second, I've heard enough of this. I've heard enough." And I said, "Well, Judge, I'm entitled to make my record." And he said, "Well, you don't have to look at me while you're doing it." It was one of the most dramatic and gratifying moments of my legal career. So he issued a stay, and then later that case was reversed by the First Circuit now based on the Meacham case. So there was no right to a due process hearing. So another category of cases that were prominent were Eighth Amendment violations. You name it, it was cruel and unusual punishment, and some of it came pretty close, we have to admit. And one of the cases that comes to mind, and this will reflect some of the comments that Dave and Jim and Chris have already made, was a suit against the conditions at MCI Concord, which has been in the news lately because it's being shut down. I was interviewed in the corridor of the courthouse after the court had ended that day, which I had become used to because every case was really, there was a lot of press interest. And I reiterated the position that we had taken in the case. Yes, I said, conditions in Concord are not ideal. We recognize that and we want to improve them, but they do not fall below the constitutional floor. So that was the position that we took in that case and what I said. And then I got in my car and I drove home from court. And on the way home, I hear Commissioner Hall being interviewed on the radio. And he says, well, yes, I do think conditions at Concord are unconstitutional. Oh, well, all in a day's work. We needed to defend these cases to prevent rulings that imposed unworkable rules. At the same time, Frank liked these cases because they gave him ammunition to go in front of the legislature. Give me more money. I need to fix these places up. So a vigorous challenge in this same vein was mounted in 1979 against conditions at MCI Walpole by two experienced and very capable lawyers. Norm Zalkind, a pretty prominent criminal defense attorney here in Boston, one of the best, and Michael Avery, ditto, also known in the civil rights field. So after a 4-week trial with these two guys putting on every witness they could think of, presenting a situation at Walpole that was pretty grim, I have to admit, the jury said no Eighth Amendment violation. So that case also was defeated, and I have to say I felt a little bit uncomfortable about that one. There were many other cases involving constitutional rights. It was really a kind of a busman's holiday for a lawyer, you know, to always be dealing with constitutional law and federal-state relations, two of the most interesting areas of the law. I really enjoyed my time there. And I'm harking back to what I heard on the first Zoom I attended for this group, and Shelley was on there, and she said, I think the reason we're all here is that we're Frank Hall fans. And I think that's true.
You know, you mentioned legislative relationships, right? So there was that as well, and you know, you had to get money to do some of these things. And how did that work, Chris?
Yeah, so quickly, in 1975, you know, in preparing the '76 budget, it was kind of a turning point for all of us and for Frank. And you know, there's, but you can't see on the slide, there's an article that came out in which he talks, you know, I'll give you some quotes here. You know, I have to fight, you know, this year not only to preserve law and order, but also progress and justice. I walked into a budget that had nothing about reform. It's the first year since the passage of Chapter 777 that the budget included anything about prison reform. So this is 1976. This is 3 years after, and there's still no program budget for community corrections. As part of this plan, he, for this budget plan, he decided to reorganize the department again, in which he created 3 area commissioners. Dave and I were 2 of them, and we had various levels of security within the area. So it wasn't just the Walpole and then pre-release. It was each of us had at least medium as well as minimum and pre-release in each area. And the real key to that was that we submitted the budget with area budgets for the first time, not just, it was program budgets for the areas, not just the institutional line items. And one of the people who was really the most instrumental in getting that budget passed for us, which was absolutely critical for the future reform effort, was Ellen O'Connor, who then had to live with the budget that she passed. But she was a senior staffer at Senate Ways and Means at the time, and we've asked Ellen to talk just a little bit about what it was like from her perspective on the legislative side of this budget.
I was a lowly staff member in Senate Ways and Means, which is a legislative committee. And at the time in Massachusetts, the government line of reporting for corrections was in the Executive Office of Human Services. And now it's in the Executive Office of Public Safety. And that reflects the kind of change in thinking about what corrections was about. Because in the 70s, it was a time of ferment and openness to rehab programs and seed money for return to community programs. There was great data from the department through the LEAA federal funding money that has been referred to that Frank Carney developed. And it was confounding to see how many inmates had little education, poor and limited work experience. They came from gigantically troubled homes. In the past, inmates were seen as commodities, and prison time was dictated by the law and the sentence. You went to Walpole, you stayed in Walpole, you got released from Walpole. And it was very flat, and it wasn't influenced by the behavior or performance of the inmate. And that's what classification was all about, taking that stuff into account. There were legislative champions, and there was a pro-rehab disposition by legislative leadership. The fact that they passed this law to allow all these programs is one example. David's story about the pocket veto of the furlough legislation is another example. Commissioner Hall's approach was communication, communication, communication. He worked very closely with the legislature. As David has said, there were two people who were daily visitors to every single legislator. They knew who the inmates were because the families were constantly saying, what are you doing to help my kid, son mostly? There was also a great focus on the public information officer and communicating, as David has said, about what was happening in the department, responding to corrections, to their questions, because the commissioner knew that what influences the legislature is what's in the newspaper. So he made sure that there were no comment, no possibility of response. He also knew, the commissioner also knew that getting control of money was key, and that, as Chris has just said, the line items put the money directly to the institution. So it was so much money for Walpole, so much money for Norfolk. There was no say on the part of the commissioner about how the money was going to be spent. And so he worked very hard to get control organizationally so that he had some say, as well as the dollar amount. So it was the money and who had control of it that became one of the two of the major tools he used to influence and make the changes. Frank had great patience, and he believed in incremental change. And the organization of the budget and the power and control of the commissioner by creating this area structure, and but he also left some line items for the institution. So he couldn't have the world's biggest fight about this stuff because there was still money directed to the institutions. There was budget pressure at the time because, of course, there was a recession in Massachusetts during 74 to 76, and that kept the revenues, the state revenues down. But it was at least 10 years before the explosive growth in healthcare costs, so there wasn't quite as much competition for scarce dollars. Therefore, some program money was available for the Department of Correction. I also wanted to observe, you may have noticed that I am not from North Carolina. So I was one of those non-carpetbaggers.
And just briefly, I wonder, did the strategy of lawsuits and fighting litigation, that Lee mentioned, as a way to say, Frank Hall to get his message to the legislature that he did need more money and he needed help, was that effective?
Of course it was. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right.
Nice softball. Thank you.
It's not always effective.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's not. I wouldn't say it's so effective now. So yeah.
Yeah. Frank liked and had great sympathy for the inmates, and he saw everything as an opportunity to make an improvement or a change, and he wasn't scared. He had been in the airborne, the Air Force, 82nd Airborne. So, I mean, this guy was a risk taker. So he wasn't afraid of having a story about a bad court case or something, because the way his mind worked, he could explain that he couldn't make it any better because he didn't have the tools, he didn't have the money, he didn't have the resources. And of course, it made all the sense in the world, those arguments, and he had the data to back it up. So they were like, well, okay.
Wow, there you go.
But there was I need to also, David and I were talking about this earlier. There was a disposition in the early 70s for rehab. Department of Mental Health was closing. It was, I'm not going as far as saying anti-institution, but it didn't have the confidence. Incarcerating people from beginning to end, in locking them up without program, people didn't have a lot of confidence in that approach. And so there was a willingness to look at seeding some other kind of approach or way, if it were done carefully with public safety and other things in mind.
Because it was also at the time when we were not allowing people, we were moving people from mental health institutions and hospitals to community-based
Exactly,
programs.
exactly,
So it was sort of a
exactly.
philosophy
Right,
of the
so it was
time.
a philosophy, and a lot of people in the legislature bought into that philosophy.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the philosophy specifically in terms of pre-release and community corrections, because that was a big proposal here. And I just want to wonder if, Chris, you could talk about the overall, policy idea, and then Jim, tell us what a pre-release center is like after Chris explains it.
Yeah, certainly. It was, as Ellen said, I mean, there was enough support, and as long as we paid attention and took care of who was actually going through pre-release and community corrections, there really was not the real resistance to community corrections turned out to be local communities. So trying to actually cite these places turned out to be a pretty big challenge. In Boston, not as much. But middle and western part of the state, we ran into some real headwind. But the thing I wanted to mention before Jim gets into what it was like was the statistic, the research that I'm going to show you in a minute was largely done by two researchers. And in 1997, they looked at all kinds of research that had been done, 30 studies around corrections at the time we were there. But they also pointed out that, so the question really is, well, why did it work? I mean, what is it about community corrections? I mean, you can sort of make logical sense that, transition into, into a job, into, dealing with a drug and alcohol program before you get out, it makes sense, and connection with families, which is a big deal. And basically what they concluded was there really were four things that the community corrections allowed to have happen, which made it work. The first was, just the real world support. So instead of when you're sitting in Walpole thinking about whether this person's going to have a job and what problems they might run into when they get released, you actually have somebody who's on the job every day running into problems which you can then try to help them solve. So there's that immediacy that pre-release and community corrections allowed to have happen between staff and inmates, which so their first finding. The second was just the close staff inmate contact allowed us to be much more careful and knowledgeable presenters to the parole boards. I'm looking at former chairman of the parole board at the time I was there, Paul Chernoff, Judge Chernoff, who we were able to give much more informed recommendations with respect to early release or any kind of early release, whether it was initial parole date or later parole date. The third was that if you didn't meet program goals or you screwed up on a community program, we could send you back. So there was an accountability that said, it doesn't just because you get there doesn't mean you get to stay there without taking advantage of what we were offering you. So there was that sort of aspect which allowed that accountability to occur. And as a result, I think many inmates, and you'll hear from Ramadan in a minute, believe very strongly that there was a peer pressure that said, let's not screw this up. Like, let's not escape on furlough. Let's not screw up a work release program because there are lots of us that really are going to take advantage of it. So there was that, and there was also the connection with families. But the fourth piece was this crime prevention. So if you think about it, if you're going to be released from a pre-release center and you commit a crime, it's very much more likely that we're going to know about it much, much faster than if you get released from Walpole and then you commit a crime. There's no follow-up after Walpole, right? There's no connection. So the research conclusion was that that was another sort of benefit of the pre-release experience. So those were the four kind of key things, that just to give you a sense of why you think it did work. But Jim actually ran one of these places. I just wrote about him and pretended. So let Jim talk to you about what that's about.
And you must have found the money, Ellen, because we spent it at Shirley. Within 18 months of parole eligibility, which is something you don't really have today, in those days, at 18 months, you could be considered for a pre-release center. At Shirley, well, let me back up. At the Reception Diagnostic Center that I worked at when I first started in corrections, when inmates are first committed, they talk about their issues as everyone else's problem. It was the courts, it was my lawyer, it was the gun that went off. I heard all the stories. When you get to pre-release, we don't care about those stories. We want to know what your plan is. What's your plan to get back to the community in a safe and effective way? And the focus makes total sense. You need a job or education or both. And we tracked 95 inmates. So we had rotary phones and cell phones were not even in existence. You had phone booths. But we tracked them at their job. We sold the community on the idea, and many employers were ready and willing and able to hire offenders before they hit the streets. They knew that it made a difference. So we had people in Shirley, and Shirley was further out than we preferred, but we had furniture makers who would hire our offenders. They learned a skill. We had apprentice programs. We even had a program that preceded Habitat for Humanity. Well, it was probably the same year, 1976, and we were building modular homes for low-income families in the community. We were focused on our community, working with the police, working with officials, and we also had a CEDAR program, so if you didn't have a job or you were initially at the center, you'd work in a community service project, and you were paid for it. And the inmates paid 15% of their salary back to the general fund. We had a 50% requirement that you had to save 50%, and Jim Matazans would know this. Many of them left with an average of $2,000, which amounts to about $12,000 today, which gives them an opportunity. We also worked with families. You want to know, where are they going on furlough? Where are they going when they're released from Shirley? Many times you would find that families would complain that an inmate couldn't get a furlough because he wasn't involved in the programs that he was supposed to be involved in. We had a program Today, Not Tomorrow when you first arrive. It was an orientation program, really. It's an opportunity for us to assess, where are you going? What are your connections? Many of them had drug and alcohol histories, still do, obviously. They were serious offenders. One of the offenders you could get a story in the newspaper, and I brought some of them with me, talking about how you were getting your life back together. And we would work with community service agencies to hook them up with AA programs, drug and alcohol programs, and we also did drug and alcohol testing. So if you ended up with a dirty urine, you were most likely to head back to a higher security institution. It was not easy to track them, but we did. And employers were very helpful with that, and all of our programs that we worked with
Can I
were
interrupt?
helpful.
What were criminal records like then? That's a big burden now, and you didn't have the easy computer access, obviously, to look and see if someone had been convicted. Were employers more willing then, do you think, to hire someone with a criminal record?
They were. They were absolutely willing to. We had offenders who had $400 a day heroin habits before they went to prison. And the employer, we couldn't tell the employer what their criminal history was, but the inmate would meet with the employer and talk about their histories and what they had done. We had armed robbers. We had, You name the offense, and this is state prisoners who are eventually, 95% of them are coming back to the community. And it, as Chris says, it's an opportunity for us to screen them before they're fully released. When we learned how to drive, did we have classroom work where we studied the rules of the road and then just hand somebody a key and say, here's the car, go have fun? We made sure that we sat in that seat next to them, guiding them as they're returning to the community. And you think it's easy. Ramadan can tell you what it's like to come back after 50 years. We had inmates who had 10 years behind bars. They're institutionalized. There were opportunities to meet with an inmate who I knew would want to get sent back based on his record. He'd want to get sent back. And I'd have to tell him, you're leaving. Don't screw up. What do we need to get you there? They didn't know how to handle their finances. They had very few skills. The employers were not only willing, but they enjoyed it. I talked to a grocer just the other day who told me that it's been years since someone has asked him to employ someone coming out of prison. And yet, he used to have a grocery store with a very active history of returning inmates. Anyway.
I think it's different now.
It's common sense.
Yeah. Well, I want Ramadan. We need you to weigh in here. We haven't heard about what it was like for the folks inside, the folks incarcerated.
Yeah,
All these
yes,
reforms were being done to help. So tell us a little bit about your story. And you know, you were at Walpole when it was considered one of the most violent prisons, right?
Yes,
what
yes.
happened?
Well, I'll just say good afternoon first,
Okay.
and I'll give you a rundown of my situation, who I am. My name is Ramadan Shabazz. I was recently released from prison after serving 51 years. I was given a commendation from former Governor Becker and his council and parole board on March 15, 2023. I was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree felony murder with a co-defendant, where 2 men lost their lives. On August 14, 1972, during a robbery at Freedom Foods Supermarket in Dorchester, Mass. I take responsibility for my actions for what I did that day. I don't blame nobody but myself. I take full responsibility of my actions. We were found guilty of murder in the first degree and were sentenced to 2 death sentences for each man's murder and 2 life sentences for the armed robbery. Each sentence were to be given out consecutively, and yes, the death sentence was active. There's a bit of humor here, I think. I was sentenced to 2 death sentences consecutively. The point is, execute me 1 time, bring me back to life, execute me again the 2nd time, and set me in prison for life sentence. When the jury, or when the public heard that, they just looked at the judge and said, wow, how can you do that? But still. On March 17, 1972, MCI Walpole had a riot. It was named the St. Patty's Day riot. I was sentenced to Walpole on March 21st, 1972. Yes, the stench of smoke, burning chairs, glass everywhere, holes in the walls. Oh yeah. This was my very first time in prison. Walpole was in chaos, and to me, at that time, the state was not in control of this prison. I was scared. Damn right I was scared. And I entered death row. The men there were hardcore criminals, old-timers from the 1950s and 1940s. Massachusetts politics was lost for words as to how to fix Walpole at that time. Governor Sargent and others, Senator Jack Backman, Senator Roy Bowling, the communities, worked up and implemented Chapter 777. together with John Boone, the new commissioner, and Frank Hall Fowle, came after him. Hope finally arrived to Massachusetts prisons. First, good food. In order to keep the population calm, you have to have good food in it. I mean, not garbage, real good food. Something that you would eat, not your dog. And they was feeding us that before all this happened. Programs, community participation. I was sentenced to Lancaster about 15 years in. And in Lancaster, a very good friend of mine, sorry, he passed away, Mr. Paul Dickow, ran that place very, very liberally. It was co-ed. He had in the towns of Lancaster, surrounding towns I can't think of now. We was in Worcester State Hospital on a regular, every day, working, just like anybody else, working 5 days a week. Paid $5, but we didn't care. We was outside of prison, doing a job for the community. We also cleaned cemeteries, we cleaned parks, we even had baseball games with the kids in the community. We fixed their fields up for them. We played with the patients in the hospital in their fields. We did a lot of work. And we also saved Billy Bolger and his men a lot of money. A lot of money. For instance, Worcester State, we were saving $1 million a year. They told us personally, you all saving us $1 million a year. But that's just Worcester State Hospital. You had Fernal School, you had other hospital programs that inmates was in and running every day. So the programs that all these good people up here implemented, it worked. It worked. And the education program and work programs in the surrounding communities, minimum, they was great. I mean, that calmed us down. As you ever heard, DOC needed a classification system to move these programs along. Once they began, the tension throughout the entire DOC became somewhat lessened for people to get an opportunity to be released, that is furloughed, etc. Walpole in 1972, the tension was so hot you can cut it with a razor blade, a razor. It was that thick. You can feel it. The moment you step inside of the gate, before you even get inside of Walpole, there's another gate you have to go through like a visitor. Then you step there, you feel the tension all the way out there. It was thick, every day. Visitors even said, what's that feel? It's the tension that's in here. So a lot of things that my comrades, I'm gonna call them, all said about Walpole in prison at the time is true. I was inside dealing with it. And being young, and there was a lot of young men there, we acted wild. We wilded out. We have no choice. There was nothing for us to do but wild out. Then programs came along. Chapter 7, 7 and 7 came along, like I said. Hopefully, the leaders will reawaken Chapter 7 and 7 today and give these men and women a chance to get this act together. It did to me, because I'm sitting here before you talking in front of a whole lot of people that I've never seen before, but I've seen these people. And when I came in today and I seen them, I said, oh, you're so-and-so, you're so-and-so. I remember the names on papers that they passed for me to move along. And I was congratulating them for doing a good job for me, because I want to do the best I can out here. I did 51 years. I have my wife sitting there, and I have other family members that help me get along and get my way along. But to make it short, please, if you can help us, help them legislators put some programs back on the market, I tell you, there'd be less money on y'all spending in prison right now. Less money. Thank you. I wish you had a question.
I think, it sounds like the programming in prison really helped you. What helped you make the transition to come out when you got out? 51 years is a long time. I mean, what do you think was key to, you're clearly very successful now and, very accomplished, and what helped?
Well, my family helped. My wife personally, she was there every day, 51 years, yes. She said, how you do that? Well, she did it. But along the way, I met Mr. Manizance. Like I said, I never knew these people face for face, but once I seen their name today, I said, oh, you're the person, like I said. But Mr. Paul Dickow was a very good friend of mine. He was a superintendent, I was a prisoner, yes, we had the relationship. And he gave me an opportunity to work at Worcester State Hospital. Now, this is the first time I've ever been outside the walls after 15 years. The first place I went to was Lancaster Pre-Release Center. It was co-ed. And he said 3 things to me. He said, Ramadan, there's 3 things I like that I don't want any man or woman to do, especially you men. So I said, Mr. Decker, what's that? He said, don't mess with my women. I mean, the girls. It was co-ed. The second thing was, I don't care about any drugs, but I care if you get busted, you're out of here. The third thing is, don't mess with my women. He made sure we did not mess with those female women there. He said, do you have a wife? I said, yeah. That should be your furlough partner? I said, yeah. I said, you're all right. And he gave me the chance, and from that point on, I didn't look back. I worked at Worcester State Hospital, and every day I went in dressed similar to this, and it felt good. It felt good putting on civilian clothes and being out in the community. I felt proud of myself, that I came from death row to now I'm outside. And now I'm really outside. So I thank everyone in this room for supporting me. And one last thing here. This is me here on March 15th in the Globe newspaper. That was me right there. Yes, pass it around. And here's the rest of it right here.
Thank you.
Oh, wait a minute, there's one more piece. Just so you can see that was me March 15th last year. Fighting for my life. But I had my wife and a lot of other community help.
And I just want to ask one
Yes,
more
ma'am.
question, because I wonder what you think. You've watched so many changes. You went from this really violent prison at Walpole. You were able to take advantage of things like furloughs, which of course stopped if folks weren't around then in the 80s. Those no longer, those stopped because they became very controversial. And Michael Dukakis, the former governor of Massachusetts, was running for president, and it became a stain on his campaign. And basically, Massachusetts stopped furloughing prisoners to really minimal programming, I hear, anyway, from folks who are incarcerated now. So how do you describe what's happening now compared to what happened 50 years ago when these folks were implementing some of these reforms? It seems so very different.
Well, now the people want to help because it's costing too much money to hold people in prison now. It's just, I'm being real honest with you, it costs too much. The medical bills that they have in prisons, you won't believe the cost. It really costs money to keep a guy from cancer, from diabetes. They get good medication there too. So therefore, you know, it just costs too much money. You have to have an alternative. The alternative is making pre-release centers for guys to get, and also you need education. You gotta have that. You gotta educate guys, because most guys in there can't count 1 and 1, which is 2, they'll say it's 3. So you have to help them with that. And I was working along with guys. I was a tutor for GEDs and things like that too as well. So I helped out on that level too. So I did many things in prison to help me keep myself together, because those guys inside depended on me to keep myself together so they can make themselves better. And now, with the new juvenile law coming out, they're coming out. I was talking to some guys yesterday. They're on the list to see if a road board to come out, and they got 30, 35, 40 years in. Some guys even have 50 years in. It's coming out. They're going to need help. So that's what got me going. And thank you for allowing me to come up here today, too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry?
I'm thankful for Boston University. They came into the prison, and he got his undergrad and master's degree through Boston University.
Yeah, well, all right. All right, all right, very good, very good. So what do the data say, Chris, about pre-release and community corrections? And, you know, if Frank Hall was a fan of data to make his case, what does it tell us?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So let me talk just briefly about the furlough program, and I referenced this, earlier about how important it was and how much at risk it really was in the early days of implementing Chapter 777. In the 1970s, from 1973 until 1980, we granted 67,000 furloughs to 60,000 inmates, and they averaged about 10.6 furloughs per inmate. In 1974, 74% of all releases from the Department of Corrections had at least one furlough. In 1973, the escape rate on from the furlough program was 1.9%, which was 134 people. And in 1980, it was 0.3%, and only 24 people had escaped. Even more interesting, the recidivism rates for people who had gotten out and had furloughs was 12% recidivism rate for 1 year. And if they had not had a furlough, it was 29%. Remarkably impactful program. And then secondly, let me just give you the pre-release numbers. In 1971, there was nobody in pre-release. It wasn't authorized. And the recidivism rate at the time, 1 year recidivism rate was 25%. In 1977, we released 56% of all the releases were either from a minimum security or a pre-release center. 56% of all releases. And that resulted in a 15% recidivism rate. So it had dropped from 25% to 15% in that period of time. And in 1980, as just a way of comparison, 1988, a number of releases from pre-release and minimum versus medium and maximum had reversed, and the recidivism rate was 31%. So it really turned out to be the only period of time in the Department of Corrections in Massachusetts in which the recidivism rate had been dramatically impacted in a positive way. Unfortunately, since then.
Yeah. So what happened? What happened? We had these systems and they worked. Jim Circo, why'd they go away?
Well, we don't have a chart up, but
That's okay. That's okay.
if we did, prison and jail population in the country would look like this. Back in from 1971 until today, population across the country has grown by 62%, and the prison population and jail population is up by 400%. In Massachusetts, the population at large has grown by 22%, and the prison population expanded to 400% before now dropping down to 200%. Those rates are really not reflective of any particular policy. The policy is we're spending $90 billion to house inmates across the country. And today, across the country, only 10% are released through pre-release. And in Massachusetts, it's only 6%. So the future leaders have to really look at what kind of system are we building for the future. But what happened? In our case, it was Willie Horton. Lifers and sex offenders are the third rail for reform. Some of the original law included furloughs for lifers. It was proved through the Supreme Court, as Dave talked about. It was pocket vetoed when there were changes potentially made. We had to send the lifers back in '87. Not only were they not receiving furloughs, but they were removed from minimum security. That was a major change for Massachusetts. But you have to ask yourself, as we develop reform of the future, what are the kinds of issues that you face depending on how you manage that system? Despite how successful pre-release and furlough is, what are the trade-offs and what are the risks versus rewards as we develop reforms in the future?
We should say there was a member of of the group who was helping us put together the information for this discussion who recently passed away, and you might want to say a few words about that.
Bill Delahunt. He was a congressman, a DA. Many around this table would call him 6 o'clock on a Friday night because that's when we'd have problems in prisons. Bill Delahunt was always there, always picking up the phone. He was a member of our working group and signed a letter to the governor not that long ago suggesting and asking her to reinstate the Governor's Advisory Committee on Corrections, and Bill signed that. He was a friend, colleague, and someone we tremendously respect and will miss. And that piece, the GACC, is still left undone for the rest of us to take a look at the Governor's Advisory Committee on Corrections for the future.
Also, I want to make sure we leave some time for your questions. I know we're running a little bit late, but I would also like to introduce two people who were really instrumental to today's event. It could not have happened without them. Like, I'm not even exaggerating at all. They organized all the information, the materials, the meetings, everything you see here today, all the logistics. Yeah, it wouldn't have come off at all unless they were here. And they are members of the Correctional Reform Working Group, and they're absolutely terrific. And I want them to, as we look at the past and think about what might happen going forward, I think that they might be able to shed some light on the lessons that they are able to take going forward from being part of this process. So Sammy Mariano and Olivia Savard, I'd like you both to come up and say something. Maybe Sammy first.
Okay. Now, I know that talking about prison and reform might not be the most exciting thing on a Friday afternoon, but we're all here because we know that something needs to change in our correctional system. Before we get ready for the Q&A, I want to take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed and what it means for each of us as members of the same community and human beings, whether we're students, professionals in the field, or simply interested in criminal legal reform. These are issues that affect our communities, our friends, and maybe even ourselves someday. We're not just talking about statistics and policies, we're talking about people's lives and making sure they leave our prisons and jails ready to be able to make better decisions than when they came in. Now, not everything we've talked about is even possible to replicate today. Our prisons and jails are home to a much different population, each individual navigating their own set of challenges, particularly in the realms of mental health and substance use. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't have community-based programs. It shows we need to be intentional about tailoring our efforts to address the unique needs of those within our justice system. It's about recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach falls short when it comes to rehabilitation and reintegration. By doing so, we empower returning citizens with the tools and support they need not just to survive, but thrive when they're released. With most of the people currently behind walls eventually returning to our communities, ask yourself, would you prefer your neighbor to transition through a pre-release center, gradually reintegrating into society, or to be released directly from a maximum security prison? Unfortunately, now in Massachusetts, the choice is starkly limited. Each year, only 87 individuals have the chance to gradually reintegrate, securing employment, housing, healthcare, and rebuilding connections with their family before release. Let's take what we've learned today and use it to have more informed conversations with those around us about the realities of our criminal legal system and how community-based programs will make communities safer for everyone. There is still much work to be done to ensure returning citizens have a chance of breaking the cycle. Thank you.
Hello. I want to emphasize how relevant and pertinent these topics are to our lives, both now and in the future. Whether we're studying law, social work, public policy, or anything in between, understanding the complexities of our criminal justice system and how it is a reflection of our society is very important. It's about being informed citizens and future leaders who can drive positive change in our society as members of the Boston University community, and we have a unique opportunity and responsibility to advocate for change. Whether it's through research, activism, or policy advocacy, each of us has a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable society. I want to encourage you all to either get involved or stay involved. This can be as simple as working to stay up to date with the news and knowing what is going on within our communities, the state, or the nation, or joining advocacy groups and research groups such as this one. We welcome students to the Correctional Reform Working Group and want you to help us learn about what you are passionate about and what you think needs to be brought to the table. I believe I can speak on Samantha's and my behalf in saying that the Correctional Reform Working Group has been eye-opening and enlightening. It has provided us with context and knowledge from our predecessors that we will carry with us into our future endeavors. While it is important to reflect on historical events and timelines, as we did with the symposium, It is also important to make connections from history to the present. History is known to repeat itself, and you, the students, are the ones who have the power to influence it. I want to thank you all for coming and enjoying this. I will turn it over to Deb and our panelists for a Q&A.
All right, the next criminal justice reformers coming up. Yeah, thanks, you guys. Seriously, this would not have happened without them. So I think we mentioned that there is an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, and you can go to Slido on your phone if you have some questions. We do have a couple right now, and I'd like to get maybe one or two questions in, and then give everyone time to have something to drink or eat before we leave. So one question here that I think is a good one. What, in your opinion, has had the biggest impact on the modern Massachusetts correctional system? Dave, you want to take that?
I think two things. If you go back to 1988, it was the Willie Horton escape. It really painted a very grim picture for what was going to happen afterwards. I think the second thing is the legislation that moved the Massachusetts Department of Correction from the Executive Office of Human Services to within the Executive Office of Public Safety. I think once corrections fell under public safety, it became much more viewed as something having to do with policing and security, and much less to do with rehabilitation and reform. I think those are two major things that have happened.
I would add,
Yeah,
let me just add.
Microphone.
I would just add that, out of the Department of Corrections' hands is that in the 1990s, the entire sentencing structure was dramatically changed. So and so the indeterminate sentence became, there's still indeterminate sentences, and there are lists and lists and lists of what crimes go with them, but many of them are largely determinate, meaning you don't have wide gaps between a minimum and a maximum. So we had often, a normal B&E, a normal break and entering was 3 to 5 years, or we had 6 to 9 years. I'm looking at Judge Chernoff here because he can tell you a lot about this. But today, you have very little room between a minimum and maximum, so you don't have 18 months prior to a release date before you're going to get released. And so that I think that the legal structure is certainly a big deterrent. So.
Maybe two other quick things. One is that in the days that we were in the department, we had something called the 1/3 and the 2/3 parole law. If you were sentenced for a nonviolent offense, you were normally sentenced under the 1/3 parole law. Meant you were eligible for consideration for parole after you'd served 1/3 of your minimum sentence. That has been eliminated. I think that the other thing was that legislation that has occurred over the years, long after we left the department, has significantly eliminated the number of individuals who are now eligible, even eligible to be considered for some of the community-based programs that we have been talking about today. They just literally are not able to apply because it's not covered by a statute any longer. They've been omitted from consideration.
Last question, just because we're out of time. Where do we see Frank Hall's impact in the modern correctional system the most clearly? Jim?
I have to say, one of the things about Massachusetts is that they took some of what we learned in the 70s and moved it to the front end. Massachusetts has done a pretty good job in deferring people from prison, from the prison experience, by having some of the work that we did that shows community-based corrections works, and it keeps people from coming back to prison, and if you do it on the front end, it keeps them from coming to prison. Massachusetts, over the last several years, has cut their prison population by 50%, and that's something that, if you look across the country, the rest of the country can learn from Massachusetts, and I think it has its basis in what we learned in the 70s that could be applied across the country. This is a national issue. Massachusetts has done overall a pretty darn good job.
And it's a marathon, right? Not a sprint, so it'll take some time. We're going to wrap with that, and I'm going to give you all time to further discuss things with our panelists. Did you want to say something, Dave?
Can I just make one more officer? It'll be quick. For those of you who are young in the audience, thank you.
There are some.
I wish for you the kind of experience that we, the people we've been talking about, including Joan Belle-Isle, who's in the audience, Tom Sellers, just, I wish for you the kind of experience we had where you get a job in some area and have the kind of experience we had where you come together with a common purpose and a common mission to work with good people, with good values, and you're able to accomplish some things, and even if they don't all last, you know that you tried. And my wish for you 50 years later, when we were all in our 20s doing this, my wish for you 50 years later is that you have the experience so that 50 years from now, when we're all in the dirt, you will be able to come together on something like this and say, this is what we did because it was our time.
And it takes more than one generation to make it work.
Right, and the Department of Correction has more than $800 million budget this fiscal year, so there's a lot going on there and a lot of work needed. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank our panelists. They really were able to give you a first-hand look at what reform looks like, and thank you all. Really, it was a terrific discussion, and I hope you all learned something, and feel free to enjoy some of the refreshments. And we are doing a series of these talks that we referred to at the beginning, and the next one is about the history of women in corrections. So you wanted to say something?
Just one quick thing.
Yes.
The marketing person in me can't help it.
Yes.
If there's a way to make the slides available to people after the event, I think some of the content, although these guys did a great job of representing it, I think some of the content you might find interesting.
Okay, yeah, good suggestion. We'll try to make the slides available. Thank you again, thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, Deb.